So for this Mad Hatter Day 2023 video, we're going to be talking about Lewis Carroll's novel Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, the follow-up to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So again, October 6th, 10/6, Mad Hatter Day, also happens to be my unbirthday. So a very merry unbirthday to me. And interestingly enough, the concept of the unbirthday is introduced in Through the Looking Glass. Despite the fact that many people associate the unbirthday with the Mad Hatter, because of the Disney version, actually the idea of the unbirthday comes from Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass. Alice is attempting to compliment a garment that he's wearing roughly around the middle. He's an egg, remember, and she can't really determine if it's a belt or a cravat. And finally, he tells her it's a cravat. And so this actually takes us into one of the really important things about Through the Looking Glass, which is this idea of language games, which are in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which we saw last year, but Through the Looking Glass is more invested in language games. So this idea of the unbirthday is introduced. Humpty Dumpty says that the White King and Queen gave the cravat to him for an unbirthday present. "I beg your pardon," Alice said with a puzzled air. "I'm not offended," said Humpty Dumpty. "I mean, what is an unbirthday present?" "A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course." Alice considered a little. "I like birthday presents best," she said at last. "You don't know what you're talking about," cried Humpty Dumpty. "How many days are there in a year?" 365, said Alice. "And how many birthdays have you?" 1. "And if you take 1 from 365, what remains?" 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. "I'd rather see that done on paper," he said. And I'm not going to read you the whole rest of the thing, but basically, Alice writes out this sum, and there's some degree of debate about whether or not mathematics is reliable for giving an answer to the question, what is 365 minus 1? So that's kind of the thing. That's kind of the pattern that we develop throughout Through the Looking Glass. It's a weird novel, in part because it moves very differently than Alice's Adventures. Because in Alice's Adventures, things happen quickly. We move through events, but there's no real purpose to them. There's no objective to the novel. It's just sort of wandering through Wonderland. In Through the Looking Glass, on the other hand, we have a different approach to how things move. Looking Glass Land is a land where, on the one hand, Alice does have an objective that she's theoretically trying to fulfill. Looking Glass Land is laid out as a giant chessboard, and Alice starts as a pawn, but if she can make it to the 8th square, she can become a queen. And as the Red Queen says, I think it's the Red Queen, as the Red Queen says, in the 8th square, we shall all be queens together, and it's all feasting and fun. So that's the objective, basically, as Alice is trying to get through the squares that Looking Glass Land is laid out under in order to get to the 8th square so that she can become a queen. So there's a teleology to Through the Looking Glass in a way that there isn't to Alice's Adventures. But despite that, Alice's Adventures actually moves through incidents much quicker, in part because they're action-driven, whereas Through the Looking Glass, most of the actions are language-driven. They're about So Alice does interact with people, but most of the interactions take place at the level of having conversations. And these characters have linguistic tics. Tweedledum and Tweedledee, for instance. One will make a statement, Tweedledum will make a statement, and Tweedledee will preface. And actually, Tweedledum's statements tend to end with the phrase know how. Then Tweedledee will make a contradictory proposition, starting typically with the word contrariwise. And so Alice actually anticipates this. So there's a British schoolboy thing from back in the day, first boy, second boy, this idea of like sort of ranking school children. So it says here, Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, first boy. Know how, Tweedledum cried out briskly and shut his mouth again with a snap. Next boy, said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he would only shout out contrariwise, and so he did. So this idea of like the recognizable speech patterns of these characters, this is a significant element of sort of character development, character creation for writers. And Carroll does this, but also draws attention to the way that he is doing this. So again, this situates us in these language games, this play with how meaning is created. We also get some additional elements of this with Tweedledum and Tweedledee, because they give us the famous poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter, which is a brilliant poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing out because it is a bit lengthy. But at the end, we get a sort of literary analysis of it. So Alice starts out, I like the walrus best, said Alice, because you see, he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. And then Tweedledum and Tweedledee had a debate with her about which of these characters is best. Because the walrus ate more of the oysters, and so Alice changes her opinion to prefer the carpenter because he ate less, but then they point out that he ate as many as he could get. And then ultimately her conclusion ends up being, well, they were both very unpleasant characters. But this idea of like engaging in logical debate, but also taking apart language as such is central to Through the Looking Glass. And I would say it's slightly less central to Alice's adventures, but still really important. We also get this more overtly with Humpty Dumpty. The Humpty Dumpty portion is a fairly long chapter. It takes up a large portion of time, and nothing really happens. So this is, I think, a great sort of microcosm for Through the Looking Glass. We have very direct references to the play of language and to what words can and can't mean and how. But we also have no real action. Nothing occurs except talking. So, so they're talking. Alice and Humpty Dumpty are talking. He believes that, because he's been promised this, that if he ever falls off the wall, which he would never do, all the king's horses and all the king's men would be sent to put him back together again. And then he says here, basically mid-conversation, however, this conversation is going on a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark but one. I'm afraid I can't quite remember it, Alice said very politely. In that case, we start fresh, said Humpty Dumpty, and it's my turn to choose a subject. And then in parentheses, he talks about it just as if it was a game, thought Alice. It is, and that's the thing. And it's weirdly about winning in some cases. Because Humpty Dumpty goes on. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were? Alice made a short calculation and said, 7 years and 6 months. Wrong, Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like that. I thought you meant how old are you, Alice explained. If I'd meant that, I'd have said it, said Humpty Dumpty. So again, we get this nice sort of thing that we get in Alice's adventures with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare and the Dormouse about saying what you mean instead of meaning what you say. But this idea of, like, Humpty Dumpty being triumphant about correcting her, he does view language as a game, and it can be played by competing rules. This is a very interesting element, because this book comes out well before, say, a philosopher like Ludwig Wittgenstein comes along. But this is sort of Wittgenstein's big idea, is that language works like games. It has sets of rules, and the ways that we obey or challenge those rules determines how effectively we fit into different contexts, different linguistic contexts. And in Through the Looking Glass, as well as Alice's Adventures, the way that language games are played is often very contradictory. Because while Humpty Dumpty holds Alice to a sort of strict linguistic interpretation, he himself is completely unbound by meaning or convention. This is one of my favorite bits of the novel. Humpty Dumpty, so this is at the end of the unbirthday conversation. Humpty Dumpty says, "There's glory for you." "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant, there's a nice knockdown argument for you." "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice objected. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be master, that's all." Alice was too much puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. "They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrability, that's what I say." "Would you tell me, please," said Alice, "what that means?" "Now you talk like a reasonable child," said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. "I meant by impenetrability that we've had enough of that subject, and it would be just as well if you mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life." "That's a great deal to make one word mean," Alice said in a thoughtful tone. "When I make a word do a lot of work like that," said Humpty Dumpty, "I always pay it extra." So this is a fascinating sort of contradiction to say what you mean as opposed to meaning what you say, because here words are divorced from meaning entirely. Every word becomes what in semiotics they might call a free-floating signifier. That is, it does the work of conveying meaning, but what that meaning is not attached to the word itself. There is a disconnect between language as a sign and the meaning that it's meant to convey. So this is really, really cool stuff. It's also really philosophically interesting in terms of linguistics and semiotics. But we once again end Through the Looking Glass, as with Alice's Adventures, we end by finding out that this was a dream. But, once again, Carroll does not let us down. This is not just a shitty dream sequence ending in which things are resolved completely with no effort. There's a philosophical proposition put forward at the end. Alice is talking to her cat, Dinah. She says, Now, Kitty, let's consider who it was that dreamed it all. This is a serious question, my dear, and you should not go on licking your paw like that, as if Dinah hadn't washed you this morning. You see, Kitty, it must have been either me or the Red King. He was part of my dream, of course, but then I was part of his dream, too. Was it the Red King, Kitty? So this is interesting, because there's an ancient Chinese philosopher named Chuang Tzu, and my cat's about to leap into my laundry basket there. There's an ancient Chinese philosopher named Chuang Tzu who posed this paradox because he fell asleep by a river and he dreamed that he was a butterfly. But when he woke up, he wasn't sure if he was Chuang Tzu dreaming that he was a butterfly or if he was a butterfly dreaming that he was Chuang Tzu. As this raises all these questions about perspective and perception and how we determine the truth about the world when all that we have to go on is our senses, and our senses, especially in dreams, may or may not be reliable. And this is the kind of question that Carroll is raising in both Through the Looking Glass and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. How do we make sense of a world that's nonsensical?